With a provincial election mere days away, is there a topic, is there an issue that is more important for our health, our economy, and our future than our environment? And so joining me here on the OShow, we have Lynda Lukasik. She's the Executive Director of Environment Hamilton. It's so great to have you on, Lynda. Thank you for being here.
Great to be here.
We also are joined by Mark Cripps. And Mark, in addition to being an OShow regular because of your past work as a journalist, you have also done work at ministries, including the Ministry of Agriculture, but also the Ministry of Municipal Affairs, where you did do some work around the Greenbelt. So it's such a pleasure to have you joining us on this, I think, very important topic today.
Thanks, Laura. Hi, Lynda.
Hi, Mark.
So, Lynda, let me ask you straight up, what are you most concerned about? Like, what would be your top 5? We need to make sure that this does not happen going forward in Ontario. Like, what keeps you up at night?
The Ford government getting another 4 years in power. I mean, just look at the last 4 years and what's happened in this province. We're in a climate emergency, and the Ford government has done everything in its power, it feels, to undo any progress that previous provincial governments had been making on this file. And in the meantime, they're creating an environment that's making us, all of us, more vulnerable to the horrible impacts of the climate crisis. So, you know, I can get into more detail, but
give me your top few, because let's assume that not everybody watching has a full understanding of, you know, what he has done. So, for instance, canceling of a lot of green contracts, right? Right when he got in, bragged about it. You know, it was kind of a victory lap, all these renewable energy contracts being canceled. The 413 highway, we saw Hamilton have a big fight to not expand the urban boundary. Council voted not to, but that goes up, does it not, to municipal affairs and the minister provincially, and that can be overturned.
I would add the Bradford bypass. So 413 Bradford bypass, you know, plowing more highways through Greenbelt, which is crazy right now. It's just going to facilitate more sprawl, but not surprising because this provincial government seems to love urban expansion. And, you know, we've seen situations like in Hamilton where the municipality has come up with a plan that conforms with provincial policy. And now we're going to wait and see what this provincial government does with it, because ultimately the Minister of Municipal Affairs and Housing has to give his stamp of approval. They've also got new legislation where he could lob the decision off to the Ontario Land Tribunal to deal with. But either way, there's a whole lot of fear right now that we'll see that decisive decision at the municipal level overturned at the provincial level, which would be so wrong on so many levels, because in Hamilton, it's all about building a climate resilient future for the health and well-being of Hamiltonians, right? So that's huge. Just get into talking about things like, you know, again, you know, cap and trade. We had a whole system in place around carbon emissions designed to deal with the issue. The Ford government came into power and just completely undid all of that. And that to me was crazy, because it was generating a whole lot of revenue that was then being invested wisely in climate action, including support for private sector players like industry. You know, I know steel mills, for instance, were benefiting from research grants to help them to transition to carbon neutrality. So there have been so many decisions that are so incredibly short-sighted, but that seem to be all about dragging us back to a 1950s approach to operating the province.
Well, I think really well said, especially on that sort of 1950s approach. What we're hearing a lot of is that there's a lot of people moving to the GTHA. We know that demographically, and there needs to be affordable housing. And Ford's solution seems to be build more houses, build more highways to get to those houses. Reminds me very much of a retro kind of vision for things. Mark, what are what are the alarm bells that you want to ring?
Well, I think for me, I mean, a lot of the proposed development around the highway infrastructure, like outside of obviously Hamilton, the 413, is in existing white belt lands. These lands were set aside for future development. However, the Bradford bypass, as Lynda pointed out, does eat up a significant chunk of the Greenbelt. And so that, I don't see the purpose of more highways in terms of, you know, having a modern infrastructure, an infrastructure that we're looking forward to. It seems to be a very car, you know, we're getting back to the car. The car is the center of the universe. And I feel like that's the way this government kind of thinks. And we see that in, you know, the types of cars that are being sold now. But, you know, I I think the biggest thing for me is that the cost. People don't have yet to feel the true impact of how climate change is going to change the pocketbook. You know, you're talking about rising insurance costs for home insurance. You're talking about NatCat losses. I mean, we, you know, between 83 and in the year 2000, NatCat losses averaged about $400 million a year. Now in Canada, they average, and this is insured loss. This isn't public loss. This isn't, you know, other losses that aren't counted. Now we're averaging $2.2 billion a year in these NatCats. And you see people think, when you think about land use and you think about how you build these communities, we're not building them to be resilient. You know, you saw Barrie, like the tornado went through there, and what could have saved a lot of the damage there was a simple hurricane strap, but it's not in the building code. And the builders, they won't do anything more than what's in the building code, which I find really short-sighted on their part. I think they should be offering up resilient kind of homes, selling, you know, it's your product, right? You want to sell a product that someone's going to, but they go, oh, well, if anything happens, you know, hopefully they have insurance. You know, the amount of flooding, everybody always thinks of flooding as river flooding. But the flooding that we're experiencing nowadays is coming from above. And it's these sudden deluges of massive amounts of rain, like we saw in Burlington back in, I think, 2013. I can't remember exactly the year, but.
Well, Brazil today. I mean, Brazil just got hit with a month's worth of rain, and countless people are dead or missing from landslides, right?
That's what keeps me up at night, is that people, it's like we walk into these crises. No one, you know, I look at climate change from an economic lens. You know, because the passionate arguments don't seem to resonate. For some reason, people just, but if you explain it to them how this is going to impact you financially, I feel like we need to focus more on that in terms of how we talk about the true impact of climate change, because the emotional rhetoric just seems to get into this us versus them mentality. And I'm not sure that accomplishes anything.
Well, I mean, another example that's right in front of us, and there are so many. I mentioned to Lynda last time she was on the show, when my family went across Canada on Hoser Trek last summer, the fires in BC, and then the subsequent flooding in BC, and those bridges and train and everything, all the infrastructure crumbling. And what was the cost to BC for those extreme storms? But what happens when we get these storms and infrastructure breaks down and crumbles, and people can't get to work, and everyone's lives are sort of suspended in these cleanups and these power outages? And I don't want to sound apocalyptic here, but I think we've seen this past year some major storms in Canada that we don't remember seeing with the frequency and severity that we're seeing them now. Lynda?
Yeah, no, it's true. It's happening more often around us. And, you know, and I'll add, you know, Mark mentioned Burlington. I sure remember Hamilton in 2009. I had a flooded basement, as did everybody else in my neighborhood. And Red Hill, the expressway flooded, right? So we've seen these impacts across the municipalities in different ways, and it does immediately affect what you're paying in house insurance and what kind of coverage you're able to get. I mean, that certainly happened in my neighborhood right away. And I would add too, you know, we've got more extreme weather events happening, and it's often the most marginalized and vulnerable people in our community who are at greatest risk. Like, I'm worrying right now about us heading into 2 days at late May, early June, where tomorrow with the humidex, we're going to hit 40. So what does that mean, right? And imagine if you're someplace like Ottawa and your power hasn't been restored and you're not able to even put a fan on in your house to cope with that kind of heat. I mean, it's terrifying on so many levels, and it really underscores the need for us to shift profoundly in the way that we're building our communities and to make them more climate resilient structurally, but also in our ability to heat and cool them, right? To provide safe living environments for people. And I would add, you know, Mark mentioned the White Belt, and there's always been this debate about what was the future intention of that space. And I'm going to argue that in the here and now, within the context of the climate emergency, that White Belt has to be viewed as a food belt, because let's talk about food security, especially this year. You know, with the war in Ukraine, that's just exacerbated some of the challenges that we're going to see. But in my mind, it really amplifies for me the reality that we need to pay attention to the fact that in Southern Ontario, we're sitting, and a lot of us are living on some of the most arable land in the country, right? And so moving forward, do we allow expansion outwards to consume more of that land? And in Hamilton, you know, the White Belt is something like 90% prime agricultural land. We need to be having those serious conversations and making sure that the right choices happen, as opposed to heading down a pathway where, I'm going to say it, developers are going to line their pockets with huge profits. So, you know, I've been saying we'd be cutting our nose off to spite our face to head in that direction.
Well, and it reminds me of when we had Councillor Pursuta on, former Councillor Pursuta, who's also a farmer, talking about a critical decision that was coming up at the Conservation Authority Board. And this idea, and then we've got Save Our Streams out there. We've got all these organizations, grassroots, that are saying, you cannot expand urban boundary, you cannot pave wetlands, you cannot do these things because we need to prevent this catastrophic flooding, you know, but we also need to make sure we can grow food. And we are talking about getting rid of farmland to keep ourselves locally sustainable. I mean, do you think that connects with people? Do they look at that and say,
I think I would say Lynda rightly pointed out about the white belt, that it was sort of like set aside in another time, right? It was sort of like at the time when the Greenbelt was being, you know, done and implemented, it was sort of like, okay, developers, okay, we're going to leave some of this land because maybe we're going to need it. But she's right. I mean, times have changed. Like, we are in a completely different time period now. And, you know, in terms of, you know, food security and all the things that we've seen with supply chain disruptions and everything, like, we really need to start looking back inward to, you know, think about how we're going to sustain ourselves. And I think the pandemic was sort of like, maybe, you know, as terrible. I hope it was a wake-up call for people, not on the infectious disease side, but in the whole, you know, the economic impact of these major events and climate, like, you know, climate change. As the climate changes and becomes worse, it's going to make the pandemic look a little bit like a blip in time, right? And it's going to be long and sustained, and the pressures that are going to happen for resources and everything else. Like, you know, one of the things I was most proud of in our final time in government was we put a proposal out to expand the Greenbelt in the outer ring to protect more of the headwaters and the precious wetlands that soak the water up, that clean the water, that become a recharging area for water. And, you know, unfortunately, that never happened because the government changed. But, you know, in terms of agriculture, I mean, it's a huge industry for Ontario. And I would think there's probably some farmers out there who haven't sold their land yet, who would have something to say about, you know, having development encroach on them. And, you know, it's just become this system where a few people with resources, financial resources, are able to gobble up land and pack their portfolios. And, you know, when we do these planning horizons out now 50 years, you're just adding more to the speculative value of the land that these people have gobbled up. So, you know, there is a bit of a dichotomy there, because you do have farmers who are retiring and they're like, you know, they want to cash out. So they do sell their land and, you know, the developers have the money to buy it. And we don't have, you know, one of the things I remember from Ministry of Agriculture was a real concern about the amount of young people getting into the agriculture sector. So
right. And, you know, and listening to you, the COVID, I remember I had you on early in COVID, Mark. I can't remember how early on, but you were one of the brave who came on the show when none of us knew if the world was going to continue. And you made that comment you just made now, that climate change is going to make COVID look like a blip, essentially. And so it's easy to feel at this stage, why bother? Why bother if we are already so screwed, we've already crossed the Rubicon because we didn't listen 30, 50 years ago to the warnings? Why bother caring? Shouldn't I just go out and buy my big truck and, you know, sell my farm for profit and just kind of ride out my days? So could you both please tell me why bother? Some hope, or is there hope, or are we just crisis management at this point, Lynda?
There's hope. Please don't give up. This is an existential threat, right?
I'm asking for the teenagers I talk to all day.
And you know, and for their future and for the sake of their future, my God, we have to hope and we have to act. And you know, that's been I feel like at Environment Hamilton is like a broken record. This mantra, like, come on, we got to get moving. We have to care about this. And I'm still hopeful. And I look at some of the change that we have managed to achieve, and I'll use Hamilton as an example. For God's sakes, we got our city council in a majority to support a firm urban boundary. Who would have ever dreamed?
It took 30,000 of you to do it, though.
Right, but it happened. And those people mobilized and responded to a message largely around preserving farmland. right? I mean, we've got a whole lot of work to do moving forward to build that resilient city. And we've got threats, sadly, from a higher level of government in terms of our ability to do that. But
we had Catherine McKenna on the program, the former federal environment minister, and she came to Hamilton and we were doing the show. And she said, my parents have a no urban boundary expansive sign on their lawn, right? You know, so kudos on your campaign and that you got such momentum. But, you know, that's hopeful, except if it gets blocked at the provincial level, right?
Should the Tories get back in power and should they make the foolish decision to undo what Hamiltonians have indicated they want to see happen, they'll do so at their own risk. I mean, I think people are going to respond. People are taking this very seriously and will continue to push to see Hamilton evolve in the way that more and more of us collectively believe it needs to evolve if we're to become a city that is truly climate resilient and inclusive. You know, the two really go hand in hand. And I think what we're going to see happen is, as you know, I keep saying to people, this is the do or die decade. And I don't mean to stress people out, but it is, right? We need to be making decisions now to help us to steer the ship in a different direction. So I feel like we've made some fundamental big steps forward in the right direction. We need to keep on building on that. And I'm hopeful that collectively as Hamiltonians, we're going to come together and we're going to make that happen.
If we have 4 more years of a majority government that challenge the federal carbon tax, that doesn't think that these things are a priority, that probably watching this thinks that we're all acting like, you know, we're freaking out for nothing, is the hope still there?
I hope so. I hope the hope is still there. I think you're also going to see more, you know, civil disobedience. You'll see protest evolving in different ways in response. I'm still hopeful that we're going to see an interesting outcome at the polls. I'm not convinced that the polling we're getting on a riding by riding basis is accurate, and I'm holding on to hope that we are going to see change in the right direction. But I guess we'll know after June 2nd whether that's the reality on the ground. So that's the hope I'm hanging on to right now. But I also very, very deeply understand that, you know, that public action, public mobilization can lead to change too. So, you know, that's relevant on getting people out to vote, but it's also relevant in terms of the kind of action that happens between elections. You know, people are always out there organizing and advocating and pushing for change. And there are lots of different ways to do that. I think, you know, depending on the outcome of the election, you're going to see that grassroots action evolve in different ways in response to what happens with, you know, whoever ends up being the new provincial government.
Well, you said that very well. And Anthony Marco was on our program a couple of days ago when we were talking about what happened with the arrest of the lawyer at the Hamilton airport. And he made a comment that said, if we get another Ford government and there is this continued kind of crackdown on dissent and these other things, that there's an intersectionality amongst groups now, whether it's environmental groups or affordable housing groups, or because you mentioned there's something about inclusion around climate policy, right? The people who suffer most are the people who can least afford to suffer, right? And so he feels as though there will be a more of a bridging of all of these maybe groups that have worked in their own silos to say, no, we're working for everybody and we're working together. And so that was his message of hope. But let me go to you, Mark. You said, you know, pandemic blip to climate crisis. That's terrifying because the pandemic was horrible. And we're sitting here, you know, got through it pretty well. I can't imagine how horrible it has been for a lot of the world. So where's your hope? Where does it stem from as we get into a provincial election? And I haven't asked either of you what party people should be voting for, because I don't think it's about that. I think it's about both the other parties running, the Green, the NDP, and the Liberals, are all wanting to preserve the environment with their different policies. They're not for this kind of super build, as I understand it. So I don't think that's what we're here to do. I think it's about raising the alarm about the potential of another Ford government. You know, so where's your hope, Mark, if it exists?
Well, I think Lynda kind of keyed in on what gives me hope. The emergence of these grassroots organizations has been quite heartwarming, and you know, I'd be lying if I said I didn't join, the safe harbor, the certain one with the black and white signs.
I think I saw it on your lawn.
Yeah, that gives me encouragement. I think we're going to need a larger mobilization because I think two things are going to happen. And again, I don't want to give away what I think. If Ford is reelected, let's just say that. The urban boundary expansion decision will be challenged. And I think that you're also going to see the government play a little bit, if it's the Ford government, play a little bit of this game of, targeting certain wards within Hamilton with some high intensity and density targets, in order to create a little bit of that NIMBY chaos in those communities and put some of those councillors who maybe have fought against urban boundary expansion on their heels. And we all know how that goes. And so I think that mobilization, I hope more than anything, that we see those same groups about saving farmland also come to the defense of councillors who end the density and intensification targets we do need within our existing community. This is how we win this battle to save farmland, as we say yes to new development, intensity, densification in our existing neighborhoods. So that, those groups, the mobilization gives me hope. And, I hope they stay nonpartisan, because that's the one thing that concerns me the most, is this shifting to partisan leanings. But anyway.
Well, and as I mentioned, that's why we're not getting into that at that level here on this program. It's about the bigger picture, right? It's about the health and safety and equity in all of our communities, I think, across the province, and protecting our children and their future and keeping the hope alive, which I think is critical, and staying active. Thank you both for doing this on such short notice. I really appreciate your time and the efforts that you make towards not just alarming us about these issues, but actually making the kind of policy change and the kind of awareness that people need. So thank you so much, Mark Cripps. Wonderful to have you on the program. And Lynda Lukasik from Environment Hamilton. Thank you for being the voices people trust on the issues they care about. And everybody, get out and vote. June 2nd. Don't pretend that this thing is all a done deal and that there's no chance. We have a responsibility to go out and vote for what we believe in. So please, 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 no matter what you're hearing about polls, go and vote. Thank you all.